The Unwritten Note. The late afternoon sun, thin as watered-down tea, slanted across the hardwood floor of Arthur's study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. 64 years old and still, he thought, a boy in love. Not with his wife, Eleanor, whose presence was a comfortable silence in the house, a predictable hum of life, but with a ghost, a memory with a face, a voice, a laugh that had aged only in his mind. It was Sarah, of course. Sarah from the days when his hair was still thick and dark, when his shoulders didn't ache from simply existing. He saw her last a decade ago at a mutual friend's funeral, a brief, polite exchange that was all the more agonizing for its mundanity. He had watched her from across the room, a woman now with silver threaded through her dark hair, with a network of fine lines around her eyes that were the only true testament to the years. And he had felt it all over again, the same adolescent clench in his stomach, the familiar pointless ache. Now, years later, the feeling was less a sharp pang and more a dull, persistent thrum beneath his ribs. It was a weight he carried, not a burden but a part of his very architecture. He saw her in the way the light fell on a certain shade of lavender in the garden. He heard her in the distant, unfamiliar chords of a jazz piece on the radio. It was a foolish private chapel he tended to, a small and sacred space in his mind where he could revisit moments, a hand brushed by accident, a shared smile that lasted a beat too long, and wring from them a meaning they never truly held. The novel opens with Arthur, a retired architect, finding a small, leather-bound book of poetry tucked away in a box of old things. It's a book he lent to Sarah when they were in their 20s, and she'd returned it with a small, folded note tucked inside a page. He'd never opened the note. The story will follow Arthur as he navigates the last decade of his life, examining his past choices and the emotional landscape he's built around this unrequited love. The narrative will weave between his present reality, his quiet, content life with Eleanor, his conversations with his longtime friend Michael, who also carries his own regrets, and fragmented memories of his youth with Sarah. The novel won't offer a dramatic reunion or a resolution. Instead, it will be an exploration of what it means to live with a persistent, unfulfilled desire. It will examine the quiet courage it takes to confront a life not lived, and the subtle beauty in finding peace with the way things are. Arthur's journey isn't about winning Sarah's affection, but about finding a way to gracefully lay his ghosts to rest, or perhaps, to finally accept them as an intrinsic part of himself. It is a story about the melancholic art of letting go, even when you've never truly held on. He picked up the small book, the leather cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. It was a worn copy of Robert Hass's Praise. He remembered the specific poems he'd read aloud to her in his small, cluttered studio apartment, the one with the bay window that looked out onto the city, a view now long since buried under new construction. He remembered her laughter, a quiet, bell-like sound that seemed to scatter the shadows in the room. He had been so young, so full of a clumsy, boundless hope. Arthur ran his thumb over the spine. The gold lettering faded to a ghostly whisper. He opened it to the page where a small, folded note remained. The paper was the color of old bone, brittle and thin at the creases. A silent testament to a moment he had frozen in time. A note he'd been too afraid to read then, fearing it would either confirm his suspicions and break his heart, or worse, offer nothing at all. He had tucked it away, letting the unread words become a symbol of a beautiful, unfulfilled possibility. A perpetual what if. Across the hall, the low murmur of the television told him Eleanor was watching the evening news. He could hear the familiar clatter of a teacup on its saucer. Their life together was a meticulously constructed harmony, a duet of comfortable habits and unspoken understandings. It was a good life. He loved her. But the love he felt for Eleanor was a warm, steady hearth fire. The love for Sarah was a wildfire that had burned long ago, leaving behind a scarred but fertile landscape. A landscape where wildflowers of what might have been still bloomed. His friend Michael had once called it a ghost limb, the phantom sensation of a presence that was no longer there. Michael, a retired professor of history with a face carved by years of quiet disappointment, was the only person Arthur could speak to about this. Michael, who had spent decades in a marriage that had soured into a polite and mutual indifference, understood the nuances of unrequited longing, though his was for a life he never had, rather than a person he couldn't have. Arthur felt the weight of the years, the accumulation of choices and consequences. The ache in his back, the slight tremor in his hands, they were all reminders that time was not a friend. He sat in his study, the book of poetry in his lap, and wondered what it meant to be an old man still carrying the heart of a young boy. To be a man of so many years, with so much history, and yet still be defined by a single, unfulfilled moment. The unread note felt heavier than a stone. It was a choice, he knew. To either let the past remain a beautiful, unexamined monument, or to finally open the note and face the truth, whatever it may be. He looked at the small note, the paper brittle and a pale, almost sepia tone. He'd never opened it, choosing instead to let the unread words hold all the potential and all the pain of a life not lived. The note, small as it was, had become a monument to a beautiful, unfulfilled possibility. It was his own personal Pompeii, a moment frozen in time. The note was a secret he'd kept even from himself, a choice made in his youth, when he'd been too afraid to face what the words might say. What if it was a simple thank you? Or what if it was an acknowledgement of his own feelings, a gentle but firm rejection? To an insecure 20-year-old, the ambiguity had been a kind of protective shield. But what was it now? Cage. He thought of Michael, and of their quiet afternoon conversations over coffee. Michael, who had taught history for 40 years, had a profound respect for the weight of the past. He'd once told Arthur, "We're all just living histories. The problem is, we're also the unreliable narrators of our own stories." It was a truth that resonated deeply with Arthur. He'd spent decades curating a narrative of his life with Sarah, a story where the unrequited love was a noble, beautiful tragedy. But what if it was all just a misunderstanding? What if the note, with its simple, folded silence, held a completely different meaning? He stood up, the old book in his hands, and walked to the window. The late afternoon light was fading, and the world outside was beginning to blur into shades of gray and purple. He saw his own reflection, an old man with tired eyes staring back at him. The man in the glass was not a boy in love. He was a man who had lived a life, a good life. He had a wife he loved, children he was proud of, a career he'd enjoyed. Was this quiet, persistent longing a sign of a life well lived, or a life still unfulfilled? He unfolded the note. His hands trembled slightly, a tremor that had nothing to do with age. The paper, a soft, fibrous linen, held up as he carefully smoothed it out. The note was brief, written in a hand he still remembered. The script was elegant and slightly slanted, like a row of dancers. The words were not what he had imagined for all those years. They were not an avowal of affection, nor a gentle rejection. They were something else entirely, something that felt both anticlimactic and profound. He read them once and then again, and as the words finally settled into his mind, the ghost of Sarah, the woman he had loved for so long in his imagination, began to finally, quietly fade away. The note was a single sentence, written in a hand he still remembered with an almost painful clarity. It was a note he had, for decades, built an entire cathedral of regret around. And now, in the dim light of his study, the words were a simple, elegant hammer, striking the foundation of that cathedral and leaving him with nothing but air. The note read, "This poem on page 62 reminds me of you." He turned to the page she had marked, the paper slightly discolored from where her thumb had held it. The poem was The Unwritten, by Robert Bly. Arthur read the first stanza. A boy is walking with a girl, and they are in the moonlight. And the girl is saying to the boy, "I am in love with you." The boy says nothing. He is looking at her face. He stood there, the words a quiet ache in his chest. It wasn't about love, not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't a rejection of him, or an acknowledgement of something he couldn't have. It was something far simpler and far more profound, a shared moment, a connection over art, a reflection of a feeling she had seen in him. It wasn't a secret he'd been carrying all these years, but a quiet, open gesture he had simply failed to see. The unrequited love wasn't hers for him, but his for a ghost he had created, fed, and nourished with his own longing. He had built a monument to a moment that had never been his, all while missing the beautiful, quiet truth of a moment that was. He felt a wave of emotions, a gentle sadness, a freeing relief, and a profound, bone-deep understanding. The sadness was for the years lost to a delusion. The relief was for the truth, however late it came. The understanding was for the nature of his own heart, and the subtle, fragile way it had protected itself from a truth it wasn't ready to hear. He looked at the unread words, at the poem she had chosen. He saw not a rejection, but a gentle, poetic embrace. She had seen him all those years ago, not as a man she couldn't love, but as a man who was already a poem, and she had simply offered a quiet translation. He put the book back in the box and closed the lid. The box was no longer a tomb of regrets, but a repository of memories, all of them finally in their right place. The late afternoon light had faded completely now, and the room was filled with a soft, settling darkness. From the other side of the house, he heard the faint sound of Eleanor calling his name. He walked out of his study, out of the darkness and into the light. He closed the lid on the box, the click of the latch a small final sound that seemed to seal a lifetime. The box, which had felt like a coffin of his past, now felt like a simple container, holding memories that were no longer burdened by the weight of a different life. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the box. It was a beautiful, simple thing, and for the first time in years it was just that. He walked into the living room, where Eleanor was sitting on the sofa, a book in her lap, the television's low hum a gentle companion. The light from a single lamp cast a warm, golden circle around her, illuminating the silver in her hair and the familiar, gentle curve of her smile as she looked up. "There you are," she said, her voice a soft melody of contentment. "I was just making tea. Do you want some?" "Yes," he said, and the word felt like a promise. He sat down beside her, the cushions sighing in his familiar weight. He took her hand, and the simple warmth of her skin, the calloused softness of her palm, was a truth more real than any ghost. Her love for him was not a fiery, breathless thing, but a quiet, steady presence. It was the warmth of a hearth in the middle of a cold night, the silent understanding that comes from a shared life, a shared history. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not a consolation prize for a love he never had, but a woman he had chosen, a woman who had chosen him back. The love he felt for her was a quiet kind of miracle, a testament to what a life could become when it was built on shared ground, on mutual respect, and on the simple, powerful act of being there. He had spent so long tending a garden of what-ifs. He had forgotten the beauty of the one he was actually in. And as he sat there, her hand in his, a single clear thought settled in his mind. It was not a tragedy to have lived a good life. The unrequited love, he realized, was not the love he had for Sarah, but the love he had failed to give to the life he was actually living. The past was no longer a ghost haunting him. It was a part of him, a part he had finally understood and, in understanding, released. The boy in love was gone. And in his place, a man, in the late afternoon of his life, finally saw what had been in front of him all along. He had spent so long tending a garden of what-ifs. He had forgotten the beauty of the one he was actually in. And as he sat there, her hand in his, a single clear thought settled in his mind. It was not a tragedy to have lived a good life. The unrequited love, he realized, was not the love he had for Sarah, but the love he had failed to give to the life he was actually living. The past was no longer a ghost haunting him. It was a part of him, a part he had finally understood and, in understanding, released. The boy in love was gone. And in his place, a man, in the late afternoon of his life, finally saw what had been in front of him all along. The next morning, he woke before Eleanor. He made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise. The world was not different, yet everything had changed. The mundane beauty of the day, The slant of light, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of a bird singing in the garden, was no longer a muted backdrop to his internal drama. It was the main event. Later, as they ate breakfast, he found himself telling Eleanor a story he had not thought about in years. It was about a trip he and Michael had taken in college, a hilarious and foolish misadventure that had ended with them getting lost in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Eleanor laughed, a real, unrestrained sound that made his heart feel lighter than it had in a long time. He felt a sense of profound intimacy, a closeness that had nothing to do with the grand, dramatic gestures of romance, but everything to do with the quiet, shared moments of a life lived together. He had always thought that love was a destination, a perfect, singular point in time and space. But now he understood it was a journey, a continuous, unfolding path. It was a choice made every day to be present, to be open, and to love the life you have, not the life you could have had. The unread note, the unrequited love, the decades of longing, they were all a part of his story. But they were no longer the end of the story. They were simply the prologue to the rest of his life.